All right, so good afternoon. My name is Braden Etzerza, and I'm from British Columbia, Canada. And this is my research that I've been conducting over the last few months. So I'm an Indigenous student from Canada, and the word Tsimshian in my language is a word that means inside the Skeena River. And it's this river that has sustained our people for millennia. So for my project, I focused on my home community of Metlakatla, as well as 3 other coastal Tsimshian communities in regards to food insecurity and food access. And with that, in these communities, there are high rates of diabetes and obesity. And this, although I focus locally, this is a problem in Canada that's widespread and most likely around the world for Indigenous peoples. And before I start, I'd just like to point out that majority of these photos were taken either by myself or my uncle. So the Tsimshian people, along with the Tlingit and the Haida, represent the Northwest Coast cultural area, which is characterized by Indigenous carvings such as totem poles and traditional ceremonies such as potlatches. So this just shows where our community is located, but for those of you that may not know where British Columbia is, we're located on the west coast of British Columbia, kind of near the north, near Alaska. So the lives of the Tsimshian people were cyclical and followed the seasons, and each season brought within it abundance of food. But it was the return of the salmon in the summer and fall that was the foundation of our food supply for the coming year. So large amounts of salmon could be caught, smoked, dried, and stored for the coming year, But salmon was not the only thing that we ate. Our diet included a rich variety of seal, abalone, cockles, clams, various land-based proteins, and medicinal plants and roots, and even fresh food was available in the winter. So Tsimshian society was well organized to utilize these resources with respect and to often trade and share with others. So basically, food mapped the landscape in traditional Tsimshian territories. So in pre-contact times, my people traded goods with other tribes, and they traded wealth items and cultural trades. And these connections reached far into the interior and across North America. So before European contact, Tsimshian society was well organized to use these resources wisely. But from the 1870s onward, this resource control was slowly being taken away from them in a variety of ways. And one of these pivotal pieces was the Indian Act of 1876. So our traditional territories were now being classified as Crown land. And with the introduction of the residential school system and the reserve system, this further restricted our access to these food resources. So this just shows how the Indian Act affected my people. Our food as ceremony was being cut off, with our potlatch, one of our major ceremonies, being banned. Our food as sustenance was being undermined. Our traditional methods of catching salmon were being banned or regulated, or you had to have a permit to start harvesting these seafood. And often Tsimshian people found themselves being arrested for hunting out of season. And our food as economy was undermined as well, with one of our main food sources being banned. So with colonization and governmental policies and industrial activity have all impacted Tsimshian food gathering practices and culture in various ways. And many of these modern consequences are a result of a more modern diet. So we have high rates of diabetes in these communities and high rates of obesity. We have a loss of our traditional knowledge and a decrease in traditional food consumption. And that kind of leads us to the problematic journey to the grocery store. So in all 4 communities, there's presently no grocery stores available, or no grocery stores. And all these communities can only be accessed by either float plane or by boat. So my community of Metlakatla is half an hour one way from the grocery store, whereas the community of Hartley Bay is 3.5 hours one way to the grocery store. And with a lack of grocery stores, we also have a lack of employment. So people often have to choose to stay within their community or move to an urban center for more employment opportunities. And for those people who do choose to stay in the community, they are often dependent on financial assistance from the British Columbia government. And that amount can range between $610 per month for a single individual to $1,300 for someone with a disability. And the average cost of groceries for a family of 4 in northern British Columbia is around $1,121 per month. So this just is an infographic that shows someone living in Hartley Bay, the farthest community from a grocery store. They have to take a one-way float plane ride or a ferry ride at $200 one way or $50 one way, and they'll get their groceries in Prince Rupert, where prices are higher than in urban centers such as Vancouver. So they'll take these groceries with them for another one-way ticket home, and they'll also pay for freight. So when we compound this with our traditional food resources being threatened, our traditional knowledge that's been lost and not passed on, and the increasing the cost of gas and boat equipment, we have a real problem here. And that problem is accessibility to our traditional foods and market-grown foods. So this is just a photo of my great-grandmother, Judy Layton, and she's out picking seaweed. And these are our traditional food gathering practices that are being lost and maybe not passed on. And these are the things that need to be reinstated. So the word there, sit yao, is a word in my language that means change. And that's exactly what's needed for these communities in regards to food access, both traditional and market. So from the solutions landscape, we have a few key players who are working to fix this issue. We have First Nations Health Authority, who provides healthcare funding for health-related programming in the communities. And we have Northern Health, who's working on a 3-stage system to address food insecurity. But the real change is coming from the community level, whereas my community has a Meals on Wheels program that provides food for elders. There's a greenhouse initiative in another community, and there's some communities that are developing cultural programs, but the resources and funding are quite limited. And within Canada, there's some successful models that could be adapted or modeled within these communities. So we have Garden Hill First Nation, who has started up a 13-acre farm and is providing food for their community. And we have a reconciliation economic model that farm is based on. And we also have the Souk First Nation on the West Coast, who has implemented a community greenhouse and solar program. And there's also Arctic cooperatives. And some of these gaps that I've identified or points of intervention would be bulk buying or hunter and fisher cultural programs, community business ventures, or collaborative greenhouses. So through this process, I've learned a lot, not only about my own culture, but I've learned that there's a lack of research on these communities in regards to food insecurity. And a lot of this research that's being conducted is done by non-Indigenous people for the benefit of their degree or their master's program, and it's not affecting change within our communities. So it needs to be our own people conducting our own research for the benefit of our people. But to really start, to really fix the issue of food insecurity, historical traumas need to be addressed, such as residential school system, the 60s scoop, and the genocide of Indigenous peoples in Canada. And First Nations community and culture needs to be at the forefront of that healing. I also learned that there's a different definition of food security for Indigenous people in Canada, and this needs to be respected by NGOs, governments, and healthcare providers. Also, traditional knowledge transfer needs to be reinstated, and our cultural teachings needs to be passed on to our youth and our younger generations. Also, our transfer of traditional harvesting and food processing skills have been disrupted, and this can be seen in high rates of diabetes and obesity. So we need to let our people start harvesting our food the way our ancestors did, because it's much more nourishing than market foods, and through that a source of healing and reconciliation and our culture can be found. So I'd just like to say thank you to all these people who have helped me with my project.
Thank you, Braden. I'll hand to our judges.
Thank you, Braden. So in thinking about your different levers of change, how would you prioritize them?
I think, is this on? It's on? Okay. I think the number one priority for change would be coming from healing from our historical traumas, and that's where we can really address these issues of food insecurity. So the residential school system really had an effect on my people and many people across Canada. So a lot of times they're dealing with alcohol issues or drug issues, abuse issues. So these traumas need to be addressed before we can really start tackling the real issue of food insecurity.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.